Welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm Kathleen Walter. Joining us is Grover Norquist, president of Americans for Tax Reform, a group that crusades for lower taxes and less government. He is also on the board of directors of the National Rifle Association and the American Conservative Union. Welcome back to Newsmax TV, Grover.
Good to be with you.
Despite the GOP midterm rout, Democrats scored many victories for their agenda in the lame duck session. Why do you think that so many Republicans capitulated, in the words of Senator Lindsey Graham, on issues like Don't Ask, Don't Tell and the newly ratified START treaty?
Well, it's interesting. The tremendous victories that Republicans had were in getting tax cuts extended, which I didn't think was going to happen, and in stopping the efforts by the Democrats in the Senate to spend the next year's budget now, to use the Democrat majorities in the House and Senate to basically commit resources for the next year rather than let the Republicans that come in the House and strengthen in the Senate in January to begin to cut the budget. So real victories on less spending and lower taxes, but there were a series of votes that the Democrats had their supermajorities and they used their lame duck to take some victories home.
Now, I want to ask you more about the budget and taxes in just a second, but do you think that the spirit of bipartisan agreement that we saw in the lame duck session will carry over to 2011?
No, because bipartisan means two different things. When the Democrats have a supermajority in the House and a supermajority in the Senate, and you have a bipartisan agreement, that's the Democrats forcing a few Republicans to go along with them for a Democrat win. Bipartisan in next year is going to be a Republican majority in the House, a strong Republican 47 votes in the Senate, forcing Obama and the Democrats to vote with them. So bipartisanship depends on who's on top.
Okay. Well, Republicans appear poised to pick up a few more House seats as a result of the 2010 census. Does that, as some say, solidify their hold on the House for at least 10 more years?
As you point out, the big difference between the Republican win in 1994 and the Republican win in 2010 is that the 94 victories for Republicans were in the middle of redistricting. So when a Republican won with 51% of the vote in a district, he had a tough race in 96 and 98 and 2000. For a lot of the Republicans now in over 145 congressional districts, redistricting will be done by the Republicans in the legislature, and if a Republican narrowly won a seat in Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Texas, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, redistricting will strengthen and solidify existing Republicans in Congress, but also probably pick up for the Republicans 10, maybe 15 additional House seats.
What about 2012? Who do you think will run for president on the GOP side, and who do you like and dislike?
I like the one who's going to win the primary.
Okay.
And the reason for that is people need to get in there and compete. If somebody has a glass jaw, I want to learn about it now in the primaries, not in the general election. I want them to play rough and tough with each other while being polite and dignified, because rest assured, if there's a fault, if there's a challenge with one of these candidates and they become the nominee, that fault will be highlighted, not diminished in the general election. So Sarah Palin could run credibly, Speaker Gingrich could run credibly, Mitt Romney has done this once before. That's a tremendous advantage for a candidate to have gone around the track once. There are 10 Republican governors who've either already done enough to justify running for president. Governor of Texas, Rick Perry, Bobby Jindal of Louisiana, the Republican Governor Chris Christie of New Jersey, and Republican governors just coming in Florida, in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin. Any of those in the next 6 months could do something impressive and make that the basis of a credible race for president in 2012.
Well, earlier we touched on taxes. Was the deal Republicans struck with President Obama to extend the Bush tax cuts worth it in the end? Or do you think that they should have waited until the next Congress?
They had a lot more leverage now, oddly enough, because the Democrats were, in fact, jammed by the coming change in tax policy. The toll that Republicans, the bribe that Republicans, the hostage that Republicans had to deal with was Obama's insistence on extending unemployment insurance payments for about $55 billion. That was not offset by spending reductions elsewhere. That was the unfortunate cost. Much of what we passed was just good policy, continuing the 2001-2003 lower tax rates, taking the death tax from 55% to 35%, exempting not $1 million of people's assets from death taxes, but $5 to $10 million in assets, expensing for new business investment. Those were all very good, very helpful, pro-growth tax reductions. We did pay a toll. That was the spending on unemployment insurance. It is my hope that Republicans will insist on clawing that back in January.
Now, Congress has approved a temporary spending bill to fund the government for another 10 weeks. As the new GOP House gets to work next year, where should the spending cuts start?
You start by taking the $1 trillion in domestic discretionary spending, pork barrel spending, that Obama, Reid, and Pelosi added in 2009. People are familiar with the famous TARP bailout. They're familiar with the famous stimulus bailout. A lot of people are not understanding or not aware that they also put in $1 trillion over the next decade, about $100 billion a year, in just more stuff in the normal budget. That has to be re-upped every year. That can be stopped January, February of this coming year. So that's $1 trillion over a decade off the table simply by stopping the spending spree. There's some other unspent money from the TARP and other bailouts and the stimulus plan. That can also be stopped from going out the door again.
Grover, do you think that Republicans will be able to balance the budget, and should they risk a shutdown of the federal government, a move that proved disastrous for the GOP back in 1995?
Yeah, it's important for us to remember what happened in 1995. The Republicans passed a very good budget with lower taxes, spending restraint, reforms of Medicaid, welfare reform, and President Bill Clinton vetoed it, and he closed the government down. Republicans didn't close the government down, he did. However, CBS, NBC, and ABC all announced that somehow the Republicans who'd passed a budget, Bill Clinton, who hadn't even bothered to write a budget, had vetoed the Republican budget. He closed the government down, but it is true that the Republicans took much of the blame. What's different now? Fox, Newsmax, talk radio. There are a lot more ways for the American people to learn what's really happening in Washington. The internet is a reality for almost every American. That wasn't true in 94, 95, 96. So if Obama vetoes a Republican budget, I don't think that he can convince the majority of Americans that the Republicans closed the government down. People will know he did.
Now, a bipartisan group of senators is aiming to revive many of the deficit reduction recommendations from the President's Debt Commission. There's agreement on the general idea of broadening the tax base by eliminating many existing deductions while at the same time lowering personal and corporate tax rates. Would a plan like this be a good thing for America?
Well, the answer is no if they're taking the entirety of what's called the Simpson-Bowles Commission ideas. That included somewhere between $1 and $3 trillion in tax increases. And the reason it's not clear is that the thing was written in pencil and fudged and only outlined what it's doing. Somewhere between $1 and $3 trillion in additional taxes is what's in that commission report. It is true, as you point out, that there's some good pieces attached to the bad stuff. Reducing marginal tax rates for individuals, for companies. Those would actually be pro-growth. But some of the deductions and credits they want to eliminate or restrict would raise taxes on citizens, again, $1, $2, $3 trillion over a 10-year period. So we could take the good pieces of those ideas and get rid of the bad ideas. I think using Simpson-Bowles is a flawed idea because that commission was set up to trick Republicans into supporting tax increases. We ought to stay away from that, a mile away.
Now, in your view, should House Republicans pass legislation calling for dramatic income tax revision and perhaps elimination of the IRS?
I think in the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, it would be a very good idea to pass bold, radical reforms. In the Senate, where the Democrats have a veto power, I don't know how much time you want to spend negotiating with Democrats who want higher taxes when we want lower taxes. How much time do you pretend that the Democrats share your vision of limited government, strong economic growth, and a vibrant private sector? That's not Obama's vision. It's not Harry Reid's vision. It's not Nancy Pelosi's vision. So if they want to agree with a pro-growth constitutional government that the Republicans offer, that's great. But we should not take any steps towards their vision of oversized, fat government that American people cannot afford.
The Treasury Department says the U.S. government has fallen deeper into the red in fiscal 2010, with liabilities topping $2 trillion. Were there any surprises to you in this report?
No, look, the economy is weak. The government is spending too much money. It's spending too much money at the local level, the state level, and at the national level. We have got to rein in this spending. And it's interesting that the government's spending time chronicling how bad they're doing, but Obama did nothing in the last 2 years to stop that bad movement.
What about the states? Some are saying state bankruptcies could be the next bubble. Do you think that the Fed should bail out the states?
No, the Fed should never bail out the states. And in point of fact, local governments have the option of going bankrupt if they would like to. They would have the protection of bankruptcy law that they can opt into. At present, states cannot go bankrupt. They just sort of keep going and never get any better. It would be a good idea to pass a law, as several congressmen and senators have suggested, that would give states the same options that a city or a county or a town has, saying if they get in too bad a jam, just as a regular business or individual, they could go bankrupt, liquidate their obligations, renegotiate their obligations, and move forward. For some states, going bankrupt may make a lot of sense. It is a protection. Right now, California could drag the whole country down, and people in Texas and Indiana and Maine would be paying taxes for the rest of their lives to bail out government union workers and their gold-plated pensions in the state of California. That should never happen. Better California goes bankrupt than it takes down the rest of the country.
Now, the Americans for Tax Reform has been very outspoken on this last issue. The FCC approved 3-2 along partisan lines the so-called net neutrality rules on internet traffic. Your reaction to this one?
It was a very bad idea. It was done through executive order because there were 95 liberal Democrats who ran for Congress, literally 95, who signed a statement saying, we demand net neutrality. They all lost. They all lost. If you want a national referendum by the American people on whether net neutrality is a bad idea in search of becoming the solution to some undefined question, it's right there. Giving the government more power over the internet is a very, very bad idea. And net neutrality is just another word for government control of the internet.
All right, Grover Norquist, President of the Americans for Tax Reform, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching Newsmax TV.